So the global markets have been going through a lot of things where the inflation has been rising and the global banks have been raising interest rates. So what's your take on that?
So what we are definitely seeing, the biggest macro change which has happened is inflation has gone up across the world. Now, but having said that, inflation has gone up in most countries because of supply disruption. So that's the general global factor which has caused. On the top of that, there is a war going on in Europe, which has resulted in the oil and gas prices to get elevated. But beyond that, there is also a demand component. Now, this demand component is limited mostly to the advanced countries. So, what happened in the advanced countries is that they reduced their policy rates very significantly during the global financial crisis. And after that, though some of them, like US, has raised rate, but they haven't restored the pre-global financial crisis level of interest rate. And on the top of that, they also injected a lot of money during the global financial crisis, and whole of this liquidity was not subsequently withdrawn. So, in a sense, if you look at from 2008 to 2020, these countries followed a very benign monetary policy. Whereas in the emerging markets, first of all, they didn't inject so much of liquidity after the global financial crisis, and second, they raised their policy rates subsequently, starting from, in case of India, starting from as early as in 2010. So consequently, the monetary policy was much tighter in the emerging market countries, and because of the loose monetary policy, and then subsequently when the crisis happened, the developed countries gave a huge amount of fiscal stimulus. For example, in a particular quarter, the amount of fiscal stimulus in UK was as much as 25% of GDP. In US, it was as much as 19% of GDP. In Canada, Australia, it was as much as 14% of GDP. So you already had a very benign monetary policy for more than a decade. On the top of that, very accommodative fiscal policy, and also there was huge liquidity infusion by the central banks. So all these things culminated into very strong demand. While the emerging markets also did stimulus measures in response to the pandemic, but first of all, they are coming from a much tighter monetary policy regime. Second, the extent of financial fiscal stimulus given by them, or the money which was injected by the central banks post the pandemic, that extent was generally much lower than the advanced countries. Consequently, demand in the advanced countries went up very significantly. Until June 2022, the growth rates in most major North American and West European countries were close to their 10-year high. So that basically shows how strong demand pressure was there. So combination of the supply side disruption and demand pressures resulted in the inflation in the advanced countries reaching between 2 to 7 decade high. But in contrast to that, the inflation, while it rose in most of the emerging markets, this was within the decade high. So if you take India, you take Indonesia, you take China, inflation in some of these countries increased, but not so much as in the advanced countries. Now, because the inflation has been so high in the advanced countries, these countries are carrying out aggressive monetary tightening, and at the same time, they are also withdrawing liquidity from the system. So and obviously the fiscal stimulus which they had given earlier, that's not being rolled forward. So all these factors are resulting in significant destruction of demand, and that's what is being reflected in the growth outlook. On the top of that, the war has created its own problem, especially in Europe. So in all these things, there has been a serious dent in growth across the world, and the recession word is being discussed pretty extensively. So that's the global backdrop.